So to get started, we are going to, I want to make some joke about diving off the deep end or into the deep end or something, because we're going to be talking about cruises. Surprise. To get a feeling of Lauren's work tonight, she's going to start by reading an excerpt from an essay that she published in Harper's about the Goop cruise. If you don't know what that means, you're about to learn. If you've never heard of Goop, get ready. Lauren, if you could briefly tell us what this piece was about and then read the excerpts for us.
Yes. So I'm going to read the beginning of it, which explains how the piece came to be. But for like a year before the Goop cruise set sail from Barcelona last September, there was a lot of talk on the internet about like how every single person, every single writer wanted to be sent on the Goop cruise, and they would volunteer as tribute and all this kind of stuff. And so then when I got an email from my editor that asked, I was the one that I had to go, and I sort of was like, this burden, this mission was placed on my shoulders. And so many of you probably know what Goop is, but if not, it's Gwyneth Paltrow's wellness empire. It's sort of a company, but she sells lots of different things, you know, like skincare stuff, sort of
freaky stones,
wellness stuff, stone,
magic
like
pills.
Yeah, like, and she also sells clothes that they're called G-Label. She'll do workshops, not like this workshop. They have a food delivery. They have a food delivery service in LA. They have all sorts of stuff. And she was. I'll read this, so I won't give it away, but the idea was go on the Goop cruise and tell us what you see. And the title of the piece is called "I Really Didn't Want to Go," and I will just read that. I'm gonna read the beginning. They told me they couldn't offer me an interview with her at this time. Fine by me. I didn't want to talk to her anyway. She talks a lot and she doesn't say much. A Financial Times profile published on the occasion of her 50th birthday suggested we have her to thank for spirulina, celebrity skincare lines, the good divorce, blended families, sex positivity, and dry skin brushing, which is just what it sounds like. I've also heard she maybe made yoga happen. This is all obviously ridiculous, flatly ahistorical, except maybe the celebrity skincare line thing, but that doesn't matter. Even if someone thinks she's done more harm than good and that a lot of it is just an upscale scam, they will comment wearily, pragmatically, just a little bit enviously, that you have to respect it, don't you, what she's done. She has successfully integrated her imperial wellness company into American life. Memories of a time when gut health wasn't something you discussed at parties are distant. Moms are microdosing, vulnerability reigns. The countervailing spirit of resistance to quackery and fake news that characterized the Trump era is over, and eggs made of jade that you're supposed to put in your vagina are still for sale. Everybody knows about the vagina eggs. The elderly know about them. People from Belgium know about them. What comes next, epocally, is still unclear. In the meantime, she has been, for some reason, partnering with a cruise line. Last summer, I got an email from my editor asking, sneakily, among the how are yous, have you ever thought about writing on wellness? She was looking for someone to go on the Goop cruise. Like most female writers, I had thought about writing on wellness, mainly in terms of the free stuff I could get to do so. And for name recognition and potential hate read appeal, a Goop assignment is the ne plus ultra of wellness writing. I don't know anyone who uses the Goop skincare products, much less reads the graphomaniacal website or attends the, quote, in Goop health summits. But I had a hunch the products, the actual Goop, were nice. The email sat smiling, evil, in my inbox, certain of its power. It didn't care how uninteresting I thought the phenomenon was. It didn't care that I'd already done my time at a feminist website, escaped, and moved on. Our genre was calling, and it knew I'd pick up because I'm addicted to my cell phone. Bizarre anecdotes would be collected, holistic therapies undertaken, details of my personal life shared. Ideally, I would cry. As a woman, I cry frequently. So as a feminist, I have a duty to destigmatize it by doing it in public. That's the prevailing philosophy. The first thing everyone wanted to know was whether my vagina would be involved. Sorry, too far. I'm sure you won't be putting jade eggs in your vagina, a friend wrote to me, on a moving boat.
You're such a good writer. You're so funny.
Thanks.
The Lauren Oyler fan club is right over here. Unfortunately, we will not be discussing the vagina eggs tonight.
Well, I didn't put them in there.
Thank you for that disclaimer.
Yeah, that's a spoiler.
I wanted to ask.
We get into that later. But
but what's so excellent about this essay and so interesting about it is that you're performing criticism on multiple levels. So at base, you're criticizing Goop, which is objectively, we can all agree, ridiculous and insane. You're criticizing the cruise industry, which is, again, ridiculous and insane. If anyone here is a fan of the cruise industry, I'm sorry, kind of. I'm not really. Cruising is weird.
They should be illegal. I think I say that, and they're just really destructive.
Yeah, they're just bad for the earth, bad for the people on them. So you're criticizing those, which is kind of easy criticism, and you do it in a very funny way. But you're also criticizing the wellness industry at large and its relationship to women. And then above that, you're criticizing people who criticize the wellness industry and people who write about it. And then above that, you're criticizing the literary history of writing about cruises, which I learned while I discovered your wonderful writing is something that exists. So you're responding to a very famous essay that's been written about cruises, and you're responding to this wealth of literature that's being written about the relationship between women, feminism, and this weird phenomenon of wellness. Can you tell us about these levels of critique that you're undertaking?
Yeah. So I guess the thing that I get the assignment, and I often write like critical essays, right? I write a lot of book reviews. That's kind of how I got my start as a writer. And I increasingly was sort of getting bored of writing book reviews, and so I got this, and I was like, oh, well, this is exactly what you asked for. You're bored of writing book reviews.
Get on the boat.
But my immediate reaction was, okay, criticizing Goop has been done many, many times, and there's nothing else. There's no new critique to make of Goop and of the wellness industry in general. There are many, many people who do this very well. Also, as you mentioned, the cruise essay is a sort of like cemented genre in particularly American nonfiction writing because of this David Foster Wallace piece called, it was also published in Harper's in 1996. Yes, 1996. You may know it as A Supposedly Fun Thing I'll Never Do Again. When it appeared in the magazine, it was called Shipping Out. And they basically just sent him on a cruise, and they were like, tell us what you see. And he wrote this amazing, like, hilarious, sad essay about it. Very long, very great. And so since then, anytime someone gets sent on a cruise, they sort of have to reckon with David Foster Wallace.
Very hard thing to do.
Yeah, so
Not an
I
easy
know
man to tackle.
So I get the assignment. I'm like, okay, here's my assignment, which is I have to allow for these things that already exist, and then I have to beat them.
Do it better.
Do it better. And so I guess like by making it into a narrative, it allows you to sort of digress into different kinds of criticism, sort of like critical tangents. And also it helped that they gave me 10,000 words, so it's quite long. It's like a 40-page essay, I think, if you were to print it out. So
is that typically the length of the essays you write?
No, I mean, so in No Judgment, which unfortunately you guys can't read yet, but
excellent.
Emily has read some of it. Those essays are quite long. But in general, a lot of criticism is published like in magazines, right? And so magazines have a lot of specific parameters that you have to follow, which are really good for writers, but also like I find them to be like a prison at points. Like sometimes you want to like break out and like do something really long. And not conform to the magazine's house style. If you read The New Yorker, you're probably very familiar with the concept of the house style. All the pieces kind of sound like New Yorker pieces. And so I like writing for Harper's because they don't have this house style and they let you do this kind of crazy stuff, as I do in this piece.
It's crazy, yes.
But it's sort of funny that we start talking about this when we're trying to talk about criticism, because this is like, I'm trying to do criticism differently now because I've gotten so bored with the kind of 3-section magazine review of an author and their work, and the sort of like is quite tedious at times, I think, and it all sort of runs together. So I'm trying to like find ways to insert criticism into other forms where you wouldn't necessarily think of it, also in my novel and in essays like this.
And I think as this night progresses, the main problem question for us is obviously going to be understanding what criticism exactly is. It's not something that can be defined easily, and I suspect that we will come to an understanding of it as we progress through this conversation. I'm going to be mean and just ask you if you want to try to define it now.
Well, so when I was coming to the library today, I went to one of these like sad vegetarian bowl lunch places.
And it's full of them.
And the woman who was working there, I was paying her, I gave her my card, and I was like, I'm sorry, I don't speak French. And so I was paying her, and she said very cheerfully, but in this kind of like ominous way, she said, "Enjoy Paris, pay attention." Yeah. And so I think, like, I don't know, that's not really a definition of criticism, but the first step is like paying attention to things and then trying to understand what effect they create, right? Or why they're there. And you can come to many different conclusions. But maybe that's like a very broad, evasive answer that is still satisfying.
Very satisfying. And it's so interesting because I've been thinking as well about what I think criticism is, and in so many ways your role is to almost be like a trend forecaster. Like you have to take assessment of the world around you, be so present to it, and then be able to kind of see what is actually invisible and make it visible, which is something that is produced through writing. It's a sort of writing workout that in contending with the object, you write through it and it becomes something. I think that if we want to dive more into what criticism is, a useful place to start is by addressing what criticism isn't. And I think there are a lot of different kind of things that resemble criticism very closely but are not quite it. So examples of this are critique, which seems to be slightly different from criticism, perhaps taste, opinion, feeling, news reporting. Can you speak to these characteristics of something that isn't quite criticism?
Yeah, I think criticism is advancing like, well, the issue is that all of the sort of normal words that you would use have fraught historically. So it's like you're advancing an interpretation, but you have Susan Sontag's famous essay against interpretation.
She looms over
which
you.
is also criticism. Are you advancing an argument? Like, I don't really like argument that often. Sometimes it's quite useful. Are you advancing like a critic has taste? Certainly, everyone has taste. Everyone has feelings. Whether you write from those feelings or use those feelings as evidence is a question. News reporting, I think, over the last several years, we have seen sort of a widespread recognition and like assertion that actually like all news is biased, right? So that's quite interesting to think about. There's no such thing as objectivity, right? This is sort of a high level idea that has filtered down to sort of people on Twitter being like, no one is telling the truth. There is no truth. I think it's sort of backfired. You're going to take it a little bit too far. Maybe you can. I think that criticism is also asserting that what you observe and observations have value, what you notice has value, and that you can sort of derive meaning or just sort of understanding from like what you observe. You can make a pattern out of it. Which can happen in any number of ways, right? Like you can, I think maybe one would think about something like social media or Goodreads or Yelp or even like a restaurant review on a website and think like, oh, that's not criticism, but actually that's just the forum. You could probably do great criticism on TripAdvisor, and people certainly do. So this is, again, not answering the question, but you knew that I wasn't going to answer the question.
That's not what you're here for. You're not here to answer questions. It's interesting that you say it's not really arguing, because it's, in my head, that is how I would picture what criticism is, in the sense that it's also not fiction, but it is creative, but it's contending with things that are real around us.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think, too, like, you can sort of, you can say anything as an argument, right? Yeah. Like I would argue that your sweater's beige, but someone might say it's taupe or something, or someone might say it's light tan, right? Like you can make an observation that seems straightforward, but actually it becomes an argument, like in just saying it. And what I mean when I say I don't like arguments is basically to go back to the oppressiveness of magazine editors, which is that like a lot of criticism that's published in periodicals, whether it's a newspaper book review that you might read in the New York Times, or like one of these in a sort of New York Review of Books, London Review of Books style magazine. Sometimes the editors will want you to like have a thesis statement and have an argument. What are you arguing? And so therefore everything that you're writing sort of leads back to that argument, which is I think quite a limited way to think about art and literature.
It leaves less room for kind of wandering.
Yeah, and I think like you can't just be like putting disparate thoughts. I don't think that's what a piece is. But this also relates to like, how do you is criticism also art? What is the relationship between the artist and the critic? Oscar Wilde, critic is artist, and like how can you make your criticism into something new as well? And so how is it functioning as a piece of writing?
Yeah. And there's two things I want to touch upon with what you just said. And the first is something you mentioned in No Judgment when you talk about the common misperception that criticism, and specifically criticism of pieces of art in the world, discourage creative production because they're mean and they're negative. And you claim that criticism is in fact generative. Can you explain this?
Well, I think it can go on forever, right? You could like the idea of like, what book would you take if you were stranded on a desert island for the rest of your life, right? So the premise of that question is that there are some books that you can like read and reread and think about forever, right? So that's one way that it's generative. But also I think criticism functions in the public forum in a very unique way. We can just leave aside the question of the internet for now, just thinking about the sort of basic relationship between the artist and the critic, which is the artist makes something and publishes it or puts it in public, and then they expect, because of the way our society functions, like they expect that critics will review it. And part of the function of the critic is simply journalistic. They're saying like, okay, I write for a magazine, I'm gonna tell all of our readers that this thing exists and you could buy it or go see it or whatever. And then another thing is they're adding something to it by interpreting it. And often, because I wrote a novel, one of the great things about it is if you read the reviews and someone says something positive but that you didn't think about when you were doing the novel, it's great. If it's negative, you don't like that. But it is generative because you get ideas from it. I mean, it's very simple. Like, it's just more ideas, more thinking, more writing.
It's interesting that you say that. I wanted to ask you as well about the role of criticism kind of in the larger cultural ecosystem, and you've just touched upon that a little bit, because one of the main characteristics of criticism, if we want to define it positively, is that it is public. It's meant to be published, it's meant to be read and consumed. It's not just the private thoughts that you have about something, but it's something that the world is meant to know about. And that has an interesting relationship with the first person nature of criticism. Mm-hmm. It comes from you, it comes from your I, your name is attached to it. Do you believe that the critic is a sort of character that is constructed in the writing of the piece, or is the I that speaks in the piece you yourself?
Well, I guess if you're a writer and you're writing pieces, the way that while you're writing pieces, you're constructing your I, like as a critic or like as a person, right? But I think there has been a sort of rejection of a sort of straw man critic of the past lately, which is the idea that the critic is a sort of like godlike observer who is sort of like handing down his pronouncements, right? And it's always a man, because the critic is sort of a feminist critique, which is like, oh, criticism used to be like that, and now it's more subjective, and therefore it's more multifaceted and true. I think actually a lot of like the style of like older criticism versus new, where you have someone who is, if you have a critic who is not like wringing their hands about their eye and like, who am I to say this or whatever, the subjectivity is kind of understood, right? And I think in the past, writers sort of expected their readers to have a certain baseline understanding that, of course, what I'm doing is subjective. Of course, these are my opinions. I don't need to say that over and over and over. But now there is this like feeling that people need to like tag their subjectivity wherever they can, right? And I think, first of all, it's just a waste of space, you know.
We know it's your opinion.
Yeah, of course it's your opinion. My name's on it. Like it's
that's the definition of what it is.
Yeah, exactly. So I don't. What was what was the actual question that you asked?
It was convoluted, and it was about whether or not you think that you're constructing a character when you write these first person.
I think people who construct a character like consciously, actively, like that's one of their goals, like tend not to be as interesting. Of course, I have a voice or a style. I prefer a style, which we could talk about the difference between those two.
Would you like to?
Sure.
Please.
Well, I think the voice is understood to be like coming from within, and it's sort of uncontrolled, whereas a style is like assuming that the writer is a writer and who is like consciously sort of constructing something. And I think in general, like women tend to be said to have voices, and I'm often said to have a voice. And you can probably have both, but I haven't read so much about this theoretically. I'm sure there's lots of literary theory about it. But, you know, if you're writing as a critic and you're not a novelist writing as a character can have a voice, of course. But if you're a writer, you have a style, as opposed to this thing that's coming from within you that you can't control.
I mean, it makes sense as a gender division, right? It's this idea that women, the artistic power that women have is something they're not in control of. It happens to them. They couldn't possibly generate that from the power of their will.
We're doing
and their
confessionals with our voices, right?
We're crying, crying all the time.
Yeah.
I want to talk more about this weird friction between what is considered to be objective and subjective in criticism. You talk about this in No Judgment a bit. You if I may spoil it slightly, you draw upon the example of Scorsese's critiques of Marvel, where he said Marvel movies are bad. I won't wade into those waters to make another water reference, but the point that you made is that he then kind of modified or qualified this critique by saying it was just his opinion, and what does he know? Yeah. When in fact he knows quite a lot, and that's another characteristic of the critic, is it's an expert, they're qualified.
Yeah, and I didn't talk about this because I'm not an academic, but there's a lot of academics who write criticism for magazines, the same magazines that I write for, and a lot of them are like see themselves as doing a kind of public service, right? They're doing public humanities. They're sort of bringing their erudition to the masses, and when they review a book, they bring like a depth of knowledge that is like not accessible to someone who doesn't have the sort of research skills or whatever, which is another kind of critic, right? A sort of educational type of person. But there's still a sort of curatorial aspect in that, right? You have to decide what you're going to focus on, like how you're going to present the information, that kind of thing. But it could seem sort of more objective, right? If you're talking about someone's biography, if you're talking about facts, rather than analyzing their style, things like this.
But in fact, that sort of, like the distinction that we are alluding to between objectivity and subjectivity in critical writing doesn't really exist, because it's all coming from a subjective standpoint.
And also I say, not to give it away, but I say No Judgment. I'm like, when I write something, I think I'm right. Like, I think I'm objectively right. But of course, that's a subjective thought. But I think, like, if you think I'm wrong, you're wrong, right? And that's a sort of like dialectical like relationship between the subjective and objective that like needs to exist, I think, in criticism, which is like, it's much more fun to read someone who like really believes what they think and is desperate to convince you, as opposed to someone who's like, oh, it's just my opinion, da-da-da-da-da.
And this is sort of what we're here tonight to learn about and discuss, right? Is the idea that there's some sort of skepticism or worry about criticism today, and there's a need when one pronounces criticism to then step away from it and say, oh, but that's just me, when in fact it's incredibly empowering and incredibly important to like things and to dislike things and to know how to articulate that, to express your opinion.
Unfortunately, a lot of people who are most confident about their opinions are like the most wrong, but like you can
except for
learn,
you, because you're always right.
Learn from them. Yeah, I'm always right. But the Martin Scorsese example is a good one, I think, because he's been on this mild campaign against the Marvel movies for years. And the Marvel movie fans are crazy on the internet. Sorry if there are any in the audience. But he would give these interviews that were quite nuanced, talking about the way that the Marvel movies like take away resources from independent art house cinema. There are no sort of small movie theaters in the United States anymore. It's tragic. And they sort of also, I like his point a lot. He wrote an op-ed for the New York Times about this as well, if you want to look it up. I like his point that if you're constantly giving people only one kind of thing, they're not going to learn to like other kinds of things. And you know, then they're used to this and it's comfortable and they understand how to watch a Marvel movie. When I learned to read like modernist poetry, it's not comfortable. But you have to learn to read in this kind of, you have to learn to watch, you have to learn to notice, you have to learn to pay attention to different kinds of things. And that's sort of a failure of American society in general, that most people don't have access to that kind of education. But what's disappointing about Scorsese is that everyone got so mad at him that he was like, oh, it's just because I'm old that I said that. Like, old, you know, like if I were younger, then I would like Marvel movies. And it was like so shocking. I was like, no, it's because you're smart. Because you're Scorsese. You know what I mean? And he's sort of, he's like, oh, I'm not an, you know, I don't know anything. I'm not an expert. It's like, what are you talking about? What are you talking about? Grow up, but there's a war on, and Martin, get it together.
And this is exactly the point that I wanted to end on before we pivot to the workshop portion of this, which is this sort of polemic about critique that we're seeing today when people are skeptical, worried about criticism. Oftentimes, we see this sort of caricature, cartoonish figure of the critic as this very elitist, snobby, highbrow figure who is positioned in complete opposition to, you know, the lowly public, the populace who like their Marvel movies. And in fact, it's much more nuanced than that, and it relates to class as well and to privilege, and you draw upon that as well. And ultimately, in No Judgment, you make the claim that, you know, no matter what, challenging art still should be consumed and is worth consuming, and that we need to be able to confront things that aren't easily digested and that push us to think in new and difficult ways. Can you speak to this as well?
Yeah, and I think it is like a privilege. I grew up in West Virginia, sort of working class area, working class family. And I grew up reading like Harry Potter and sort of crap and like Dan Brown and all this stuff. So I like know, I understand it. Like I've read it. I'm not like been like spoon fed like Henry James since I was 4, you know, like whatever. But I think the idea that, you know, people who have jobs, the implication is always like, oh, if someone like, if Taylor Swift is really popular, it means she means something to these suffering people who are idiots. And it's so condescending, right? And you're like, they don't have to be idiots. It's like, no, that it's actually like creating, it's reifying elitism to say that like, oh, if you don't have access to like very expensive, very expensive private education, you can't enjoy more difficult things, and therefore we must respect that they like Taylor Swift because they can't help it, right? And they can help it, and like it's just a sort of facile, patronizing, condescending argument, I think. And of course, what Martin Scorsese writes is true, which is that if people are just served one kind of thing, they're going to want more of that kind of thing. But I think the question, if we can get a little socially minded, is like, how do we introduce like difficult films to people? Like, how do we like introduce literature to people who like don't have access to it? Because we do have the internet, which, while terrible, also a great resource. You know, there's lots of stuff on the internet for free.
It's bad, but it's good.
You can basically learn about anything on the internet if you want. So I don't have answers to those questions.
You are answering the questions. you're
but that's my feeling.
Those are excellent feelings.
Yeah.
Can we have a round of applause? I want to stress again everything that Lauren just said, which I think is very truthful of the values of a library as well. That it's empowering to educate oneself, to take to take one's own education into one's hands. Look around you. Look at all these books.
I didn't even do it on purpose. They're not paying me.
You're too good.
I'm not an influencer. This is not a hashtag ad.
It's all a hashtag ad for reading and lifelong learning.